Teesside, when it first started off, was the target for desperate, hungry men coming to work in the steelworks. And of course, there was a division between them and the outside. You've got Eston and Normanby, Bullyback country as we called it in those days, where the miners lived, and where there was a division between them and the people on the south side, which was the Irish and the labourers and the iron workers.
The shadow of the Eston Hills in North Yorkshire falls across the ancient villages of Eston and Normanby, before touching on the newer communities of Teesville, Grangetown and South Bank on the southern edge of the River Tees. Iron ore gouged from these hills would shape the destiny of the whole region. In the half-century or so between the discovery of the ore and the start of the Great War, agriculture gave way to industry, as the Empire's new powerhouse unknowingly strode towards conflict. The transformation of southern Teesside from a rural idyll to a behemoth of metal and fire was astounding in both its rapidity and in its all-consuming nature. In a little over half a century, ancient traditions were swept away by the march of progress.
Eston and Normanby, the two ancient townships of the area, go back to the conquest. They were agricultural land, rich wheat fields, fed the nation basically because it was the best wheat growing area in the country. With the finding of iron ore in the Eston Hills, which are behind me, you'll find that everything changed.
At the time of the Industrial Revolution and the discovery of ironstone in the Cleveland Hills, they all mushroomed to provide industrial sleeper towns really for the big businesses, Bolko and Vaughan, the shipyards, the steelworks. So most of the people came from outside of the area. People came from Cornwall, from Ireland, from Wales, from lots of other parts of the country. The banks of the Tees were covered in steelworks and ironworks, going from 1840 right through to the 1930s and 40s.
From Stockton to the coast down at Redcar, on the south side, it was mainly marshland and wasteland with very little inhabitation at all. It was reclaimed by the steelworks, tipping the slag on it.
As those in search of work poured into the area, Eston and Normanby could no longer cope, and so new communities, ones tied to their employers, were created.
Oh, well, lots of the ironmasters and the owners of the works built houses for their workers. There were two up, two down. Sometimes they were shared. People took in lodges and boarders to make ends meet. People actually got paid not just in cash but also in kind. They had tokens to use at the shop that was at the works. They provided lots of facilities. They endowed churches, hospitals, that sort of thing. So people were not badly off compared to in other parts of the country where people actually had no work and it was difficult, people going into the workhouse, that sort of thing.
Basically, Grangetown was a Balco and Vaughan town. If you lived in one of the houses, basically you had to work in Balco and Vaughan. You couldn't live in Grangetown without working in the steelworks.
William Henry Short was born in Eston on the 4th of February 1885 to Annie Civil and James Short. Named after his mother's brother, William was the first of what would ultimately be 10 children, 9 surviving to adulthood. Although not married at the time of his birth, the couple tied the knot in May 1888, and by 1901, William Henry and the expanding Short family were on the move.
In 1901, just after the census, he moved with his family to Grangetown. As he grew up, he developed a love of football, kicking a ball around in the back street.
One of the things about William is he was known as Twig or Twiggy, and basically he would walk around chewing a bit of twig, and that was it, so he affectionately known as Twig or Twiggy.
Like most people who lived in Grangetown at that time, William's father worked for Balco and Vaughan, 2 names that dominate the history of the area. Legend has it that as John Vaughan walked the Eston Hills in the mid-19th century, he and his mining engineer John Marley came across an outcrop of iron ore, and an industry was transformed. Vaughan and his longtime business partner Henry Balco, a naturalised British citizen of German extraction, created an empire that dominated the region. As well as being the fathers of iron and steel on the Tees, they built housing and leisure facilities for their workers, named streets after themselves, and transformed the region through fire and furnace into a powerhouse of modern heavy industry. The time eventually came for William Henry Short to follow in his father's footsteps and to join the ranks filing through the gates of Balco and Vaughan.
$6 in the morning up to work, and that was from the age of about 14 maybe. People didn't go to school, people went to work. You needed to go to work to earn some money to help to keep your family. So a lot of younger men in the works originally started as pushing barrows, ore barrows. They then went into the furnace. People then progressed. Short became a driver, and that was an important job, moving things around the site. Quite a technical job as well, so people had to be a little bit more adept than just pushing a barrow. So obviously a little bit of promotion early on from when he worked at Balco and Vaughan.
While the men of the area were in service to industry, wives and daughters ran the households.
She looked after her family. She cooked, she cleaned, she washed. She did the washing, she washed the front step. They were very house proud. She went to church on a Sunday with her children, made Sunday lunch. She would have to look after maybe her father or her mother, who lived often with families. You see on a number of gravestones you have mother-in-laws and father-in-laws written on the stone as well, who came to live with the family after maybe they'd been widowed. People actually had to live within close proximity to the work, so you see within 6 and 7 streets you maybe had 5 and 6 generations of a family, cousins, aunts, uncles, and it was a case of I would look after somebody. They were also involved heavily in helping out people at times of important events, like becoming the local midwife, looking after people who were ill, helping to lay out the dead and conduct a funeral, that sort of thing. So all the events that happened as a community they were very highly involved with. They were sort of maybe the glue that held everything together.
As the 20th century progressed, the inhabitants of the area, both new and old, would have settled into a routine of begrudging acceptance. Miners, brickmakers, iron and steel workers, shipbuilders and the thousands of associated trades and their families lived alongside each other. They quarrelled over Irish Home Rule, They watched in awe as Halley's Comet travelled overhead in 1910, and, a year later, the mighty Tees transporter bridge that had been slowly gaining height up the river was opened for business. A bold statement of all that modern Teesside represented. For William Twiggy Short, life was good. He was working alongside his best friend Francis Havelock. Francis's nephew Frank was courting William's younger sister Florrie. He drove engines and cranes, and in his spare time he played football for a variety of local teams, building a reputation as a fine athlete. The declaration of war on the 4th of August 1914 took many by surprise. The events in Sarajevo earlier that summer had initially made little more than a footnote in the papers, just another political squabble between unpronounceable European states. Nothing to worry about. It was a bank holiday weekend, and the people of South Teesside headed for the coast. One of the first signs that something was amiss was the disruption to the train timetable. The Territorial Army, part-time soldiers for home defence, had been on exercise over the weekend and clogged the railway network as they were hastily recalled. Holidaymakers mingled with khaki troops, cheering them on as the great adventure began. To those in the know, it quickly became clear that Great Britain's small professional army, primarily used to settle disputes within the Empire, would be woefully inadequate. The newly appointed Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener, a hero of the Sudan and of the Boer War, recognised that mass mobilisation and recruitment was essential. Thousands of men across the country, including 29-year-old William Henry Short, had a decision to make.
When war broke out, along with lots of his football teammates, they very quickly decided that they would join up.
We believe there was recruiting off into South Bank, so we believe we joined up there. As a lot of people did, even from Normanby and Eston, that seemed to be joining in South Bank.
William and his best friend Francis joined the 8th Battalion of the Yorkshire Regiment, known as the Green Howards, becoming part of Kitchener's army. They both lied about their age, fearing that they would be too old to join the fight.
Green Howards, although based in Richmond and very much a geographical identity, was actually raised in Somerset in 1688. And at that point, regiments were named after the colonel of their regiment. So originally it was Earl's Regiment, then it went through various hands until it ended up into a Howard. And at a particular battle in 1745, the Commander-in-Chief ordered Howard to move his regiment, and 2 men got up. What's going on? Well, I'm called Howard and so is he. This is massively confusing. We're going to have to find a way of identifying one from another. You have green facings on the front of your uniform. You're the Green Howards. You have yellow facings. You're the Buff Howards. And that name has stuck.
As a recruit of a newly formed battalion, William probably welcomed the change in routine.
The 8th Battalion are raised in 1914. Twiggy Short enlisted on the 2nd of September 1914, and he would have been around Richmond here and undertaking his training. A battalion is roughly 750 to 1,000 men, and it is the core fighting unit of the British Army in the period. So if you said to Twiggy Short, "Who do you serve with?" he wouldn't have said the Yorkshire Regiment. He would have said the 8th Battalion of the Yorkshire Regiment. They identify very, very clearly with their battalion.
In the industrial north, the response to Kitchener's call to arms was overwhelming. Patriotism, regular pay, and a change of scene all played their part in the decision-making process as the men formed long queues outside recruiting offices. A major concern was if these recruits would get to fight before it was all over. As the army attempted to manage the success of its recruitment drive, business on the Tees had to cope with a drain in its workforce and an increase in the need for iron and steel. Practicality, patriotism, and profit were not easy bedfellows.
Affected an awful lot actually, because a lot of people went, but then a lot of people were in reserved occupations and had to wear a badge to prove that they were here, because otherwise the people were giving them white feathers. So people actually wore a silver badge on their lapel and had a little certificate to say they were actually on war service, because obviously the war effort was important. I mean, a lot of the companies actually developed their own pioneer battalions. I mean, Dorman, Long, Bolko and Vaughan had their own. Some of their own people were involved. I mean, Henry Bolko's great nephew joined the army and that sort of thing. So even though they were German of origin, they classed themselves as naturalised subjects and actually joined the army, became an officer and helped people to join up. They encouraged the staff to join, and in fact in some cases they actually provided transport and ambulances and that sort of thing to go to the front with them to look after them. The companies then decided to build ships for the war effort. They were building motor torpedo boats on the River Tees. They were helping to build warships. And Bolko and Vaughan and the other iron and steel industries were then developing munition factories to help the war effort.
As William and the other new recruits of the Green Howards were being moulded into soldiers, defence of the realm restrictions were beginning to bite. Shipping on the Tees was tightly regulated. German vessels and their crews were detained, and German nationals scorned and attacked. By December 1914, Britain's professional army, swelled by territorials, had been in action at Mons, the Cateau, the Aisne and at Ypres. It had helped to stem the German advance on the Western Front at a terrible cost. Digging in and trench warfare began. The residents of Eston, Normanby, Grangetown and Southbank devoured this news, knowing that their men would soon cross the Channel to join the fight. Early in the morning of Wednesday the 16th of December, the German Navy arrived off the mouth of the Tees. In a show of strength and an attempt to bring the Royal Navy to battle, a fleet of German warships travelled down the North Sea coast, bombarding Hartlepool, Scarborough and Whitby. The 8th Battalion of the Yorkshire Regiment would have heard the news of the attack while they trained near Richmond, safely inland. This was total war, where no one was safe. In early 1915, William's friend Francis Havelock was discharged from the army. He'd lied about his age, desperate to join the fight. The rigours of training had taken their toll and left him distraught. He said farewell to Twiggy and the rest of his mates in the 8th Battalion. Training progressed and they eventually moved south to Frensham, a village near to Guildford in Surrey, before heading across to Folkestone and ultimately France, arriving at Boulogne on the 26th of August 1915. During this first year of the war, the country's mood had changed.
We're getting over that initial spirit of optimism. It's all going to be over by Christmas, if you believe that that's what people believed. But you're starting to now see people say, look, we're here for the duration. This is not as easy as we thought it was going to be. This is a difficult nut to crack. And that's starting to be fed back through letters, through diary entries. People are very aware that time for them could possibly be very, very limited given the job that they're being asked to do.
After months of training in England, the reality of life for a new soldier on the Western Front started to hit home. The enemy might be the least of their concerns.
He would be doing sentry duty, he would be doing carrying parties, he could be, in the military expression, told off to go and help the engineers build a road or dig a trench or go out at night and put barbed wire out. It really is that jack of all trades. You're not just sitting with a rifle observing what's going on in no man's land. Manpower to construct this huge network of trenches. Don't forget that front line ran 450 miles from the North Sea down to the Swiss border. Somebody had to dig all of that. Somebody had to do the dugout. Somebody had to do the wire. And again, people forget that the frontline soldier was that guy with a pick and a shovel as well. They are then seeing service in the front line along with all the other battalions, 4 to 6 days in the front line, 4 to 6 days out of the line. They're going backwards and forwards through that entire campaign until we end up at the Somme in July 1916.
Respite and distraction from duty was welcomed, and this came most frequently in the form of letters from home. William's sister was keen for any news of her beloved.
Florrie, his younger sister, is writing to them on a regular basis. She's sending them parcels, and in one of her letters she asks William, has he seen Frank? Dear Florrie, just a line hoping it finds you in the best of health as it leaves me in the pink. I have not seen Frank yet. There is no more I can write this time. We'll tell you more next time. I'm in a hurry. Best respects, Brother Will, Private W. Short.
As recruits continued to join the ranks, the labour shortage back home was becoming acute. Iron and steel were needed now more than ever.
A couple of years into the war, there was about a third of the workforce of the men in Balco and Vaughan actually volunteered. So obviously a lot of the places that the men left, obviously they were replaced by women.
Nationally, people were asked to step into the breach, and women, of course, wanted to take the place of their husband. The other thing, of course, is it was important that once the man had gone, he wouldn't get paid. You didn't know if your husband, your son, your uncle, your father was going to die at the Western Front. You didn't know whether there was going to be any money. There wasn't much of a military pension for people who'd sign up for Kitchener's army. So the women had to go and then provide an income. So it was a replacement for the husband's wages in many cases, and it was a necessity, otherwise the children wouldn't get fed. And they were doing the occupation that the men had done. They also were doing things not just for the ironworks. They worked for the railway company. They lost a lot of people straight away, the North Eastern Railway. And there are images of women cleaning trains and helping to clean out fireboxes. So it was an instant thing, and at the time it was a lot of women here. I mean, in the Tees Valley we had one of the first women Labour members of Parliament, one of the first women cabinet ministers, so it was an important scene for the suffragettes to say, well, hang on, look, we can do what the men have been doing, we can step straight in and do this job and help to maintain the war effort and help to keep things going.
Florrie, William's sister, was one of these women, taking up a job at Balco and Vaughan. After the initial shock of seeing women in what had traditionally been men's roles, the nation quickly grew accustomed to this new workforce. The shell scandal of 1915, where the effective artillery was compromised by a lack of ammunition, meant that steps had to be taken to feed the front and to keep the country moving. Supplies of ammunition and equipment were desperately short. For the women, these new freedoms would not be easily relinquished once the war was over. A sea change had begun. Florrie Short not only embraced the new work opportunities, she also decided to pursue her older brother's leisure pursuits.
He takes part in many football matches, charity football matches, to raise funds for returning soldiers who are being taken to Hemlington Hospital.
The Munitionettes football teams ran their own league right up from as far as Blythe down to the Tees Valley. And there were lots of matches, there were cup finals, there were a series of events. They were probably followed by quite a few thousand people, and they were quite important events, and lots of the teams had team photographs so people know who they are and what they look like. They're all named.
Twiggy and the 8th Battalion of the Yorkshire Regiment were involved in fierce fighting in late 1915. During the Battle of Loos in September, the battalion supported attacks at Bois Grenier to the west. After holding the line around Bois Grenier during the winter, the battalion moved to Bruay to rest, then in early spring 1916 re-entered the fight near to the German-held Vimy Ridge, a place that would become legendary later in the war when it was finally captured by the Canadians in 1917. By May 1916, the 8th Battalion was exhausted and terms of leave were granted. William Short was one of the lucky soldiers to receive his pass, returning home a different man.
It was away for 10 days. The problem was, any soldier that was up in the north, actually their leave started when they left the front line. And then what his mother said, was an interview with his mother, and he basically said they had a dog. When the dog was barking, William was like jumping all the time, you know, his nerves were sort of shot. When he left, he didn't say anything, he just went. And they sort of like went the next day, they realised he wasn't there.
Leaving without fuss or ceremony, William returned to France, one of thousands of soldiers travelling up and down the country on a daily basis. Friends and relatives were proud of the heroes on their streets. They waved flags and donated cigarettes to the soldiers. When they returned on leave, they shared news and updated them on family gossip. A few months earlier, these men had been shopkeepers and window cleaners. They'd worked the farms and factories. They held their silence. How could anyone possibly understand what had been asked of them? Trench warfare is stagnant. Men die, but little seems to be gained. Traditionally, war had been about routing an enemy and taking ground. This was a war of attrition, one where whichever side could last longest would emerge victorious. In the winter of 1915, the Allied commanders had agreed a strategy to return to mobile war. A big push was planned for the summer of 1916 to drive the enemy back and claim territory. The battle would take place astride the River Somme. Britain and her empire would fight north of the river and the French to the south, a combined effort designed to break the deadlock. This initiative was shattered in February 1916. The German army attacked the French at Verdun, knowing that France would pour troops into the area in defense, weakening the rest of the front. As France responded to the attack, the weight of the Somme operation fell to Great Britain. On the bright summer's morning of the 1st of July 1916, whistles blew, bugles sounded, and the British Army, fighting alongside troops from across the Empire, went over the top.
The 8th Battalion are around Pozières and Contalmaison. They are engaged in active operations. They are relatively, and it is relatively, spared the horrors of the first day, but they are then drafted into the line, right up to the front line, to make up good those gaps that have happened as a consequence of the attacks on the 1st of July.
What is known as the Battle of the Somme was fought for 141 days between July and November 1916. The many individual engagements and locations within the overall battle have become legendary. A month after its start, the 8th Battalion of the Green Howards was still at the heart of the action.
They are given a job of attacking something called Munster Trench, which runs just to the southeast of Pozières, and there is a junction with another German trench called Tor Trench, and they are told that they must take more of Munster Trench beyond the junction of the two trenches. And that's what they do. They actually are very, very successful that afternoon in taking more than their orders gave them. But obviously the German standard standing orders are, as soon as you lose ground, you counter-attack it until you've won it back. And that's what we were then doing. For about 5 hours, Twiggy Short and his comrades are trying to hold and consolidate that position. Twiggy is seen to be wounded in the foot, but refuses to go back. He's then wounded again by shell fire and can't then stand. Now, in his own mind as a footballer, a wound to his leg has got to be something that's devastating to him. A second wound to his leg and he can't even stand, but he still refuses to go back.
Despite his wounds, William Short stayed in the fight, refusing to leave his comrades. In agony from his leg wounds, William supported his mates by cheering them on and supplying grenades, until night began to fall and the fighting died down. By the morning of the 7th of August, William was dead. After the fighting, William's body was recovered and buried by his comrades.
One of those people that was in the trench, we discover afterwards, turned out to be Frank Havelock.
Florrie's sweetheart Frank wrote to William's mother, offering what small comfort he could to help ease her loss. Previous to his expiring, I had the pleasure of seeing him well contented. He looked on the bright side of things with a heart as brave as a lion. He was a credit to you and all. I can assure you that Will was respected by everyone, and no one feels his loss more than the men of the regiment. If I get home, I'll tell you of his brave death. You will have the consolation of knowing that you've reared a son as good a soldier as the British Army ever possessed, and he died doing his duty for those he loved at home and the interests of the country he also loved. Frank Havelock never made it home to tell of William's heroic deeds. He was killed on the 7th of October 1916. His body was not recovered from the battlefield, and he is remembered on the Timetable Memorial to the missing. The Battle of the Somme would claim both Florrie Short's elder brother and her dearest, 2 of thousands who would fall in the Great War. As the news of William's death filtered home to Grangetown, those in command in France filed their reports and made their recommendations. For his actions on the 6th of August 1916, William Henry Short was to be awarded the Victoria Cross. News that inspired the local press, who rushed to interview William's grieving mother.
And she says, you know, she was quite understandably devastated by the fact that her son had been killed. But she recognised how it comforted her when she found out that he'd been awarded the Victoria Cross. I'm not trying to make out we'd ever replace a life, but for that individual and for that community, it's that community identity that he is a part of that's being rewarded. And for her, there was a degree of comfort that the king himself would recognise her son's contribution to the war.
Presented for outstanding valour, the Victoria Cross is one of Britain's highest honours, its award meeting strict criteria.
Witnessed by a British officer, that's a qualifying criteria, and his subsequently report says that essentially what he's saying is, without the action of this individual, that position couldn't have been held, or the lives of his comrades would have been lost. It's because of his selfless sacrifice, his valour, that that action was successful. And Twiggy, again, because he refused to go back, because he wanted to stay with his mates, because he wanted to effect that outcome, essentially he bleeds to death from his wounds and dies.
The VC is the highest honours you can get. In the history of the VC, there's about 1,500, you know, so he's very, very unique for this area, and he's my family.
Relatives of William Henry Short VC still live in the area where he is commemorated and honoured. They carry the story of his life and actions with a great sense of responsibility and pride, each new generation being taught about their illustrious ancestor.
The first recollection I have is about 7-year-old. It was my father had just died, and I was rummaging through his desk, and I found the Victoria Cross.
Right, so I'm very proud. I mean, one of the things is, when I was young, I didn't know about William. My mum used to tell about William, said, oh, to me, said, oh, he was called Twiggy and things like that.
I asked my mother what it was. I knew it was something different, special, but I didn't know what it was.
Both my mum and dad died in 1998, so in 2003 I went with my brother to the Somme and all the battlefields in that area, and it wasn't an organised tour, so it was like a private tour. So we were able to go to Continental Mason Cemetery, looking at his gravestone, you know, and while I was touching it I was actually crying my eyes out, you know, that he's actually part of my family, you know, so I'm very proud of him.
In 1919, a memorial made of ironstone was erected to William in Grangetown, his home community commemorating him and his actions of the 6th of August 1916. A few years later, it was moved to Eston Cemetery, where it still stands today. The cemetery at Eston has the distinction of not only honouring Twiggy Short VC, but it is also the final resting place of Victoria Cross recipient Lieutenant Richard Sanford of the Royal Navy, a man buried far from his home.
He was born in 1891 in Exmouth in Devon. His father was the Archdeacon of Exeter. His older brother was also in the Navy, Francis, and they were both educated at Clifton College in Bristol, went to the Britannia Royal Naval College at Dartmouth. He went to the submarine section of the Navy took part in the raids at Zeebrugge, idea to demolish the viaduct and to do some work to actually do some damage to the fleet that were in there.
The raid on Zeebrugge took place on the 23rd of April 1918. It was designed to disrupt enemy submarines that were devastating Allied shipping and starving the nation of food and resources. The attack was multifaceted, involving ships, marines and submarines. The idea to block the channel, rendering the path to the sea useless and effectively sealing the port. Richard Sanford was in command of C-3, an old submarine packed with explosives. This was designed to be remotely guided under the structure of the Zeebrugge mole, explode and cut off the pier to enemy troops. Refusing to use the remote controls, Sanford personally guided the craft under the viaduct before escaping and detonating the submarine, destroying the link to the pier.
He then was appointed as a commander, relief commander of a submarine squadron that were based on the Tees at Teesport. An awful lot of these squadrons from the Firth of Forth all the way down the coast were actually covered by submarines to look after laying of minefields, to cover the channel for the coastal shipping and for all the industry to provide raw materials being able to come in and out in a sort of safe passage. There may be about 6 or 7 submarines based on the Tees, but looking after the whole of the Tees Bay, the coast at Hartlepool down as far as Whitley and Scarborough. He caught typhoid fever, was taken to Cleveland House, which was the manager's house from the ironworks that had been turned into a hospital during World War I, later became the headquarters of Eston Urban District Council, and he died of typhoid fever just a couple of months after the armistice was signed. The fact that he's here, he's been adopted as it were by the submariners, the retired submariners. They have a service here on the week before Remembrance Sunday, so he is recalled, he is remembered. Hopefully soon that the gravestone will be cleared, and maybe one day he'll have one of these centenary stones like all the others have had.
William Henry Short and Frank Havelock were killed during the Battle of the Somme in 1916, the midpoint of the Great War. Richard Sanford died of disease in a temporary Teesside hospital, far from his Devon roots and just weeks after the armistice. The Great War had claimed thousands from the area and across the country, millions around the world. The wounded continued to die long after the armistice, exasperated by the influenza epidemic that cut down soldiers and civilians alike. Those that survived were left with the weight of their experiences.
It was teeming with veterans. It was Grangetown. Every street he went into was of a family that had people who'd gone through the First World War, and of course when they came out of the war, the great promises of it was going to be a new existence, and they were going to have jobs, they were going to have a new life and so on. It faded away as the time went on.
There was an awful lot of problems. There was an awful lot of sort of organisation set up as well. Benevolent societies, and the works of course were important in helping their workmen who'd come back fit in. There was an awful lot of difficult problems for people. People came back with severe injuries, and an awful lot of people died after they'd come back from the war as a result of injuries or from being gassed.
I remember in 1933 there was a visit by the Duke of Kent, and he'd been sent up north to have a look at the poor people in the north. He'd been given a job of envoy, and they turned up at Grangetown in his Bentley with all his aides and so on and so forth. He was helped out the door, and he hesitated because there was bricks being thrown over the heads of the crowd at at the people who were in the entourage.
The peace after the Great War would prove uneasy and short-lasting. 20 years later, Europe would be consumed once again. For Teesside and the communities in the shadow of the Eston Hills, the end of the Great War would also see the end of Bolko and Vaughan. After decades of success, the company collapsed in 1929. The area evolved.
The area developed into doing different things. I mean, after the First World War, a lot of the companies that were iron and steel manufacturers amalgamated. They became part of Dorman-Long. The Dorman-Long Empire then decided to build bridges, so then we get the Tyne Bridge and the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and bridges in Australia, bridges in New Zealand, bridges in Southern Africa, bridges in South America, all designed by Dorman-Long. Similar to the war, the workforce going somewhere else, they upped sticks and went to Sydney and helped to build the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Maybe sort of 200 or 300 workmen went out there to help with it. So people diversified. People who'd been building warships during the war were building cargo ships. Cargo was important to do because the country needed to reconstruct. The country needed to make sure it was on its feet again.
100 years after the end of the First World War, towns and villages up and down the country are looking at how their corner of the country was affected. Researching the Great War is about more than the fallen. It's about people and communities responding and adapting to extraordinary events that shape the world of today. Florrie Short lost both her brother William and her beloved Frank. She went into the foundry and onto the football field, embracing changes that were both necessary and welcomed, paving the way for women's emancipation. William Henry Short and Richard Sanford are both Victoria Cross heroes who gave their lives in the service of their country. They are the high-profile representatives of the thousands of others who gave just as much.